the end, education is about learning. If there's no learning going on, there's no education going on. And people can spend an awful lot of time discussing education without ever discussing learning. The whole point of education is to get people to learn.
Just think a little bit about what it is that you believe about how kids learn most powerfully and deeply in their lives. What are the conditions that need to be present in order for kids to learn in a sticky way, learning that stays with them, learning that they can build on as they go through their lives? We know what deep and powerful learning looks like because we're learners as well. And so it looks like this. This isn't rocket science when we talk about what learning requires. We know that it's based on passion. We know that the best learning that we do happens when it's for a real audience, for a real purpose, when it has relevance in our lives, when it's not constrained by time, and when there are other people around us who are passionate to learn those things as well.
Is that children are learning organisms. Children don't need to be helped to learn, for the most part. They are born with a vast, voracious appetite for learning.
Children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves.
If you can light the spark of curiosity in a child, they will learn without any further assistance very often. Children are natural learners.
Babies come into the world extraordinarily curious, eager to learn, extraordinarily resourceful and competent at learning, that they are, in the most literal sense of the word, scientists. They do exactly what scientists do. They use the scientific method in making sense of the world around them. And then they get to a certain age, which may be as young as 3, but in any case the age of school, and this process is turned off by adults who think they are now going to direct and control the learning of these children, who they treat them like empty receptacles into which they are going to pour whatever learning they think they ought to have.
Children come into the world burning to learn about that world, and we can't stop them from learning about it unless we lock them away in closets, or we shut them away in schools and cut off their natural ways of learning.
So kids have a tremendous appetite to learn. The problems seem to develop when we send them to school, and I'm not speaking critically of individual schools or teachers at all, but there's something in the rhythms of education, something in the systems that we've created that eventually start to wear away at kids' curiosity, they wear away at their motivation and their appetite for learning.
Now I want to share with you a list of answers that no one ever gives when I ask that question. And it's amazing to me that in just about every school that I visit, in just about every classroom that I enter, these are the conditions that exist for the kids in those environments. These are the conditions that we create for them when we expect them to learn. Now, I think this disconnect between what we believe and what we practice is really powerful. And it is this disconnect that has led me to this surprising truth about schools and about learning. And that is that schools were not built for learning.
You know, for the most part, when we use the term education in our culture, and most people think of education as schooling, it's something you get. You go and somebody gives you an education. You maybe pay for an education. It's something that we think of as actively given by the teacher to the student. The words we use, the grammar we use, puts the teacher in the active tense and the student in the passive tense. The teacher teaches or educates, and the student is taught or is educated. So that's the view that we have of education, and of course that view is entirely wrong in terms of how education has always occurred throughout human history before the advent of modern schools. It always was the reverse. Education was something always actively pursued and acquired by the child.
We have radically altered our own evolved species behavior by artificially segregating children in same-age peer groups during the day, by expecting them to be indoors and sedentary for most of the day, by asking them to learn from artificial text-based materials instead of contextualized real-world activities, and by dictating arbitrary timetables for learning instead of following the unfolding of a child's developmental readiness. Our approach to education is extraordinarily authoritarian. It is obsessed with compulsion and control. So the child in a modern classroom may not move, speak, sing, laugh, eat, drink, read, write, think her own thoughts, look out the window, or even use the toilet without explicit permission from an authority figure.
Kids love to learn, but they don't all like being educated. For a lot of them, the problems start when they go to school.
School is where children learn to be stupid. And the process that makes them stupid, at least stupid in school, is other people trying to control their learning.
My point is that children have a vast appetite for learning. And it only starts to dissipate when we educate them. That's to say, when we put them in buildings designed for the purpose and put them in serried ranks and start to force-feed them information in which they may or may not have an interest.
While some children seem able to function in this completely artificial environment, really significant numbers of them cannot. And around the world, every day, millions and millions of normal, bright, healthy children are labeled as failures in ways that damage them for life. And increasingly, those who can't adapt to the artificial environment of school are diagnosed as brain disordered and drugged.
If you think of it, the whole system of public education around the world is a protracted process of university entrance. And the consequence is that many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not, because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized.
There are a lot of things that we know to be true, but we don't really discuss them. Because if we discuss them, it would put the entire experience of schooling into a conversation that many of us don't want to have. For instance, I don't think we can ignore any longer that our kids will forget most of what they learn in school. And we know this because we have forgotten most of what we learned in school. I don't think we can ignore any longer that deep and powerful learning requires a personal interest. It has to be something that we are invested in if we're going to learn it for the long term. We have to now admit that deep and powerful learning isn't served by many of the structures that we have in schools, that the only place where learning is limited by time and age and by discipline is in school. That doesn't look anything like the real world in terms of the way we learn when we're on our own. We have to admit that kids with access are learning more productively on their own outside of school than we're allowing them to learn inside of school. And I don't think we can ignore any longer that our current grading systems and the structures that we create to evaluate kids and teachers are at best counterproductive and at worst harmful to the whole process.
We in democratic societies, we believe that there are certain inalienable rights that belong to human beings. The right to free speech, the right to free association, the right to due process if you're accused of a misdeed, the right to choose your own path to happiness. What could that mean? Doesn't that have something to do with choosing how you educate yourself? These are described as human rights. We think of them as human rights. I would contend that children are human beings. And in our typical schools, we deprive children of every single one of those rights.
The model for the school should have been, ought to be, the family, not the factory. But it adopted the factory model, and it's in love with it to this day.
Every education system in the world is being reformed at the moment, and it's not enough. Reform is no use anymore, because that's simply improving a broken model. What we need, and the word's been used many times during the course of the past few days, is not evolution, but a revolution in education. This has to be transformed into something else.
So what do? You have to start totally from scratch. You have to start with an entirely different model. You can't evolve you can't evolve self-directed education out of what we have, out of what was developed for the purpose of indoctrination and obedience training.
Learning is not the product of teachings. Learners make learning.
It's about passion. Often people are good at things they don't really care for. It's about passion and what excites our spirit and our energy. And if you're doing the thing that you love to do, that you're good at, time takes a different course entirely.
I have to say I'm a fan of homeschooling. About 5%, I believe, of young people in the US are homeschooled. And I can see immediately the attraction of homeschooling and its counterpart, which is in some ways a more radical approach, which is often called unschooling. The advantages and the attractions are, of course, that parents and their children can devise their own curricula. They can have a completely flexible approach to timing. They can have their own approaches to assessment. They can move at their own pace according to the interests and learning styles of each individual child. And they can mould and shape the curriculum around the emerging interests of the children going through the homeschooling program. It's not an easy option. I think it's important to say that all the people I know who are involved in homeschooling, who are doing it well, devote a huge amount of time to it. They take it very seriously. They approach it rigorously. There are resources available to people who are committed to homeschooling. There are some great websites, some great associations, and the challenge, of course, is to provide a broadly based education which uses the expertise and skills of the students and the people doing the homeschooling, but brings in other talents and resources beyond that immediate group as well. And the internet, of course, makes that more and more possible.
Home is a much more effective learning environment for young children than any nursery, school, daycare center, any sort of institutionalized setup. Because the learning is in the stream of life. These are real things that are happening.
We need to start treating children as human beings, and that indeed we don't have to be afraid of doing that, because there's a lot of evidence that if we provide the right context, we can treat children as human beings and they're going to grow up okay. So